Thank you, Judy. Thank you to all the panel members and to all of you for being here. This paper has been written in the context of a 5-year project that I'm doing just now called Work on Demand, Contracting for Work in a Changing Economy. And it looks at trends towards precarious work more broadly. I had hoped by the time I gave this paper to be able to focus in on platform-mediated work. I haven't been able to do that. So this paper is not specifically about gig economy or platform-mediated work, but more about contracting for work generally today. The paper is a kind of position paper. I have a team of researchers working with me on the project, and the paper tries to begin to develop the approach that we're going to take over the next few years in investigating these trends towards precarious work and so on. I position the paper as a contribution to the crisis in labour law debate. I won't say anything more about that than that, because you all know about that debate. And in particular, I position it as speaking to a strand in the debate which looks to new methodologies or new approaches as a way out of the crisis. Of course, in the last decade or 2 decades, one of the main turns we've seen amongst scholars of labour law in terms of new approaches is a turn towards the labour market and about thinking about labour law in terms of labour market regulation. Of course, a lot of this work has been extremely fruitful. I think especially the parts of it which take a kind of political economy approach to looking at the labour market, I have found very fruitful. But as I've argued at length in earlier work, I think there can be a danger when we think about not labour law but labour market regulation, that the economic crowds out all the other considerations, that there is little room left for considerations of worker dignity and democracy at work and so on. In short, I think there are normative implications to adopting the language of the labour market in our scholarship, or to adopting wholesale a labour market framing. So part of what I want to do in the approach I take is to resist that, although of course I understand that studying labour markets is an important part of what we do. So I'm not saying we shouldn't study labour markets or think about labour markets. I'm saying we shouldn't adopt wholesale a labour market framing to the study of labour law. So instead of starting from the market as the object of study, I suggest that we begin from the contract as the key legal institution in the world of work, the contract for work. But I suggest that we understand that contract for work not only as likely economically motivated. Of course, this is a market transaction. It's the sale of labour in return for wages or other compensation. But it's also very much influenced by social understandings of what is fair in a particular context, by shared understandings of what's fair, by social norms which can develop in particular circumstances. And of course it's also very significantly influenced by the applicable law in different ways, directly and indirectly. The law which regulates terms and conditions of the contract, the law which facilitates or hinders collective action, and so on. I think particularly in the hands of human resource managers, law is often, or human resource managers draft contracts with notions of risk avoidance in mind when it comes to the law. So that's another way in which law influences contracting. So contracting for work is the key legal institution, but we must understand contracting for work as an ongoing process. It's not a one-off thing that happens at the start of the working relationship. It's an ongoing process as the working relationship evolves, and it is likely economically motivated, but also has important social and legal aspects. And we need an approach as scholars which can take account of all of these 3 aspects, the legal, the social, and the economic. So that's what made me turn essentially to thinking about an economic sociology of law. I don't know whether this term is familiar to all of you. It's quite an ugly compound, or a clumsy compound in my opinion, of the terms sociology of law and economic sociology. What I would prefer as a term is sociology of law and economics. I think that makes more sense. That is in essence what we're talking about, studying law and the economy and the interactions between law and the economy using sociological approaches and framings. An important question, given that I'm following Eric's paper, is what is the interaction between economic sociology of law and political economy, or what are the differences between the two? This question has been answered a little bit differently by different scholars working in the field. So Sabine Frerichs, who's in Vienna and is one of the most prominent scholars writing about economic sociology of law, she suggests that we think about economic sociology of law as having different levels of application, including the macro level, so micro, meso, macro. And I think when she's talking about the economic sociology of law at the macro level, I don't think there's really much difference between what she's describing there and political economy. Wolfgang Streeck, writing with Jens Becker, they've put it a little bit differently. They've said, in the way that they've understood the terms, they've said that they would like to see a combination of economic sociology and political economy, with economic sociology being used to understand economic behaviour at the micro level, economic and social behaviour at the micro level, and political economy being used to understand what's going on at the macro level. In short, the way that I've written about economic sociology of law here, I don't use the term political economy very much throughout the paper, but I understand my economic sociology of law to be absolutely compatible with a Marxist political economy. And I'm turning to Max Weber in a moment, but I should perhaps, when I come to rewrite the paper, say that I'm beginning not only from Weber, but from Weber and Marx, because I see my reading of Weber, or the bits that I take from Weber, as being, as I say, entirely compatible with a Marxist political economy as well. Okay, why might economic sociology of law help us to study labour law today? Well, this is to do with, my starting point is to do with the trends over the last decades, which have seen at the same time as a contraction of the scope of collective bargaining in many countries, also a weakening of labour standards, or new barriers being put in the way of workers being able to enforce their legal rights. One example in the UK was that we had the introduction of fees for workers to take claims to employment tribunals. So legal rights are being weakened or are harder to enforce. Collective bargaining coverage is contracting. As a result, the contract for work has asserted itself or reasserted itself as the primary legal institution in the field. I've explained already how I understand the contract, and that's where economic sociology of law comes in, as possibly allowing us to understand the economic, the social, and the legal aspects of contracting for work. I look in the paper at the kind of critical tradition in labour law scholarship, going back to the German Jewish scholars Hugo Zinsheimer and Otto Kahn-Freund. And I suggest that at the time that they were writing, because the coverage of collective bargaining was so widespread, and because labour rights were quite strong at the time for employees, and most people were employees, they were able to treat the contract as being kind of technically important as that which created the roles of employee and employer, and that which meant, it was only once you had a contract that the terms of the collective agreement applied to you. So it was important in that kind of technical way, but it wasn't important after that because it was kind of empty. The terms and conditions of employment didn't spring from the contract, but from the collective agreement or from statutory labour standards. In other words, they treated the kind of the commercial and individualized aspects of contracting for work as having been largely suppressed by the collective agreement, suppressed by the statutory employment rights. So they didn't, the way that they studied labour law back then, the way that most of us learned about studying labour law was to not take very much account of the individualized aspects of contracting for work. And today, with the contract asserting itself as the primary legal institution in the field, we need an approach which allows us to take account of those individual commercial elements, but without defaulting to an overly economic understanding of what contracting for work is. I've forgotten which one was mine. This one. No, you think not?
Maybe. I don't know.
Okay. I'm probably going too quickly, but I'm nervous about time. That's why.
No, it's okay. You still have 5 minutes.
A whole 5 minutes.
Or maybe more. Maybe more.
Half an hour.
Yeah, because she's going to talk about Max Weber.
Michelle's favourite. With Michelle beside me, in fact, I won't dwell for too long on Weber in case I make any mistakes. Weber, when talking about Weber's economic, so I should say Weber didn't use the term economic sociology of law or anything like that, but he developed an economic sociology, and of course he wrote about the sociology of law. And in terms of using Weber to develop an economic sociology of law, a scholar called Richard Swedberg has written about Weber, I think most extensively, very schematically, very clearly. Swedberg makes the points that you can draw two different economic sociologies from Weber's work. There is the economic sociology in the very narrow, specific sense, which comes from Book 2 of Economy and Chapter 2 of Economy and Society. And then you can think about him having had an economic sociology much more broadly in all of his work, the work he wrote before Economy and Society and so on. And in that sense, the Protestant Ethic, which is a very familiar work, would also provide an example of Weber's economic sociology, because what he's doing there is he's using his own sociological approach and his own sociological methods to understand what's going on in the economy, therefore economic sociology. So I draw in this paper on both the narrow, I didn't say what the narrower sense was in Chapter 2 of Economy and Society. He builds an economic sociology from the basic building block of economic social action. And economic social action, he says, is action which is economically motivated but oriented to others. So that's where the economic and the social come in. And he uses the basic building block of economic social action to also create definitions of what we would call institutions, such as property, contract, the enterprise, and so on. So that's all in Chapter 2. I draw on both the narrow economic sociology and the broader economic sociology in this chapter. And in the 2 minutes I have left, I'll just talk about the two main things I take from Weber. I take more than this, but the two main things. First of all, the use of this notion of economic social action to understand contracting for work at the micro level. Economic social action, he says, in a market economy is typically oriented to the law. So we can think about not only economic social action, but economic social or legal economic social action, economic social legal action. It's economically motivated behaviour which is oriented to others and to the law. But there's a lot more that we can take from Weber in terms of understanding the act of contracting for work. He has very useful things to say about the difference between contract and status, which I think maps clearly onto working relationships. And also his work, again, from Protestant Ethic, his writing about the different work ethics or different rationalities that workers have, how under capitalism, workers must work as if to maximize their utility. So they're expected to work as hard as they can for as long as they can in order to make as much money as they can. But this suppresses the traditional subsistence ethic that workers had prior to capitalism, but which also survives the development into capitalism. So instead of working as hard as they can for as long as they can to make as much money as they can, workers might prefer to work for only as long as they need to make as much as they need. And that reminds us that part of what happens in a working relationship is that there has to be a disciplining element. The worker has to be disciplined into working harder. And that makes us think not only of the worker-employer relationship, but also of the work that things like consumer debt do, mortgages, curtailment of pension requirements. All of these things act as disciplining forces on the worker to try and get them to work harder. So that's just a little bit about what Weber has to, what we can learn from Weber about contracting for work. The other key theoretical term I take from Weber is the term Labour Constitution, Arbeitsverfassung. Weber uses this term. I've written about the Labour Constitution before, but there I was writing about how Hugo Zinsheimer had used the term. Weber uses the term rather differently. He uses it in work, that early work of his on the agricultural employment relations east of the River Elbe. And he emphasizes in his definition there of the Labour Constitution that what he's talking about are, this is a quotation, relations of stratification within the larger socio-economic system. In other words, I think, social relations of production. The way I suggest we might be able to use the Labour Constitution is in terms of mapping different contexts within which contracting for work takes place. And very happily for me, Eric's paper on taxi capitalisms provides a perfect example of what I have in mind here. He uses the term taxi capitalisms. I would suggest the term Labour Constitution, but I mean the same thing as he does in that paper, providing, he called it history, we might also say genealogy of kind of ideal types of taxi capitalisms throughout the 20th century. And in my notion of what an economic sociology of law would involve, I would like to see that Eric's taxi capitalisms supplemented with some micro level analysis also of what's going on with the contracting within those different taxi capitalisms. So very happy that Eric's done that work, because I'm going to be able to use it and cite it to add to what I've done with this paper. And should I stop?
No, you have...
Oh, you still have 3 minutes.
3 minutes. Okay, so as I said, this is like a position paper, so lots of questions remain unanswered, but I hope that I've begun to sketch out the beginnings of the approach that I want to take over the next years with my team. And I think the benefit of this notion of the Labour Constitution is not only that it helps us kind of map the context within which contracting takes place, but it also can be a really useful tool, I think, of allowing us to move from the micro level to the meso, to the macro. Eric's taxi capitalisms are kind of meso level taxi capitalisms, but you could also have a macro level labour constitution of not just the sector, but of the nation. You could have a labour constitution existing at the supranational level, European Union labour constitution. And you could have labour constitutions, maybe not so much in the taxi sector, but in other sectors you could have labour constitutions also at the workplace level. So you could have these different labour constitutions, and one of the key things there would be then to understand how they interact with each other, and how they affect the act of contracting for work at the micro level. So that's a lot of work to be done, but that's where I've got to so far. One of the big questions still to answer is the bottom one, because if we think about the Labour Constitution, I said it's about social relations of production, but it's also about, it includes the law, so it's about the relevant law, relevant shared understandings of what's fair in a given context. Where, therefore, does it begin? Where does it end? What is the relevant applicable law in any situation? Because you would want to include social welfare law, potentially immigration law, aspects of family law, tax law. What isn't relevant, when you start asking that question? So that's going to be one that still needs to be worked out, a big one. And as I said, it's a 5-year project, so this is the name of the project, these are my funders, and there's the website if any of you would like to find out more, workondemand.co.uk.
Thank you.